Welcome to Quilter's Architect. My name is Mark. In this video, I'm going to show you a free downloadable quilt pattern that I'm going to share with you and invite you to sew the quilt along with me. And I want to talk a little bit about the inspiration behind the quilt, some of the fabric requirements, and the cutting instructions. So the name of the quilt pattern is Astro Journey, and I'll show a copy of this here a little bigger on the screen so you can see it. So the name of this quilt pattern is Astro Journey. This is the quilt pattern, and of course with this name Astro Journey, you can kind of get an idea of the inspiration probably. I also have as a pastime amateur astronomy and amateur astrophotography. So I have a telescope and I have a setup in an observatory to, set up the imaging overnight and capture all the images of something I'm interested in, like a galaxy or a nebula. And then there's some processing involved after that to produce a final image. What's really kind of at the center of this quilt pattern is a panel. And so first I'll show you this panel. It'd be really hard to show all this probably on the screen. So what I'll do is I'll start this like this and then kind of raise it up so you can see the whole thing. And so you can see that this panel includes the Earth, the Moon, kind of looks like the space station. In the background, we have a galaxy and another satellite. This is at the center of the quilt pattern. And although you may not have this exact panel, it's a standard size. And so we would hope you'd be able to trim your panel to a standard size. And I have that in the quilt pattern. And then you'd be able to use a different panel. And of course, I have the fabrics I chose. You may have different fabrics on hand or different preferences for fabrics as you look at this quilt pattern. And you'd be obviously welcome to choose whatever you feel will produce a very beautiful quilt. In my case, because I have this actual panel kind of with this coloring, I went with some fabric choices that kind of I felt really went along with it well. And you can see those here. I'm kind of hold them up a little bit better maybe so you can see them all together. To keep track of the names, I kind of jotted them down because unlike some of you, I don't have all these names memorized of the different fabric lines and the names of the fabric. This one is a little bit of the outsider in this set of fabrics. And this is called New Hue, and it's by Canvas. And this is kind of going to work okay with the other fabrics. It does have this speckle in it. It doesn't stand out a lot, but it seems to go with these other fabrics, which are from Ruby Star Society. And this is from their speckled line. Looking at these fabrics, I just wanted to talk a little bit. Well, I did mention here on this one before I go on. Looking at this New Hue by Canvas, you can see that it has this white with kind of a gold speckle. And then next, moving on to the Ruby Star Society speckled line, in this gray fabric, it has the white and gold speckles in it. And then for our yellow, we have yellow and copper speckles in this fabric. And then for our black, this kind of has it's real faint. It's kind of hard to see, but it has kind of a blue and red spatters on this black fabric. And then lastly, for the blue, here we have blue, green spattering, and also the gold speckles, the gold metallic speckles. I thought this fabric line, looking at, we looked online to see what kind of fabrics would look good with something that was around stars, because stars, they sparkle in the sky, they kind of dim and brighten as you're looking at the sky due to the atmosphere. If you look on the quilt pattern, you can see that I actually went with some different stars in the design. So I have like a double sawtooth star with a pinwheel in the center. There's 6 of those in the quilt pattern. And then I also have arranged in between the larger stars, I have these hunter stars and eccentric stars, and there are a total of each of those stars 16. They're kind of arranged in a different arrangement if you look from one side to the other. And then I have the coping strips around the panel, because the panel is, these panels are a little bit of an odd size in relation to block sizes. I have the coping strips to offset that difference to make the panel plus the dimensions of the coping strip when sewn together match up to the block sizes that I chose. So thinking about the inspiration for the quilt, I'm going to put on the screen here some of the different, just a few examples of targets I've chosen in the night sky to image. So you kind of get an idea of, when you do amateur astrophotography, kind of really how interesting it is to see the images you can capture and some of the inspiration behind choosing this panel and the stars in the quilt pattern. Here we have the Lagoon Nebula. This is the Wizard Nebula. This is called the Elephant Trunk Nebula. This is the Butterfly Nebula. This is the North American Nebula. This is the Omega Nebula. This is the Horsehead Nebula. And this is the Heart Nebula. So let's talk a little bit about the fabric involved in the fabric requirements. Regarding this panel is one of those 23 by 42 panels. And of course, looking at the pattern of the quilt and the way my panel is oriented, it may not make a lot of sense if you had a panel that was landscape oriented as opposed to portrait. This one is going to be portrait, because it's oriented this way, long ways. And so that's a consideration for your panel selection. Some people might not want a panel turned sideways in a quilt. So looking at our fabric requirements, here's the gray color that I chose. And for whatever color you choose that corresponds to that, we're going to need 1.25 yards of this fabric. And then for the blue fabric, which in my case is this fabric, we're going to need 1 5/8 yards. And then for our black fabric, which I have this categorized also as our dark fabric, we're going to need 2 7/8 yards. And this occupies a lot of the background area of the quilt. And then also for our light fabric, which is in my case this white with the speckle, we're going to need 1 1/8 yards of that. And then finally we have, in my case, another medium fabric, the yellow, and we're going to need 1 1/4 yards of that fabric. One of the things that looking at the cutting instructions, I was thinking about the last time I did a quilt and I was going through the cutting, and I don't know what your technique is, like everybody has like a way they go about doing things and what they feel makes it the easiest. And I think the way I did it last time was not very efficient. I think I was sitting here at the table, the cutting table, and each time I would get to another piece to cut, I was calculating, okay, if I cut those strips out of the width of fabric, how many of those strips do I have to cut to get that many pieces for that specific fabric piece? And so what I did is for this one, some of you probably have done this for a long time, something you already do. But what I did is I went into Excel and I put in a formula based off of the width of fabric that I have, which I can get just a little bit over 42 usable fabric out of the fabric width. I guess that means this is like 44 or 45 is the width of fabric. But by the time you cut off the selvage, you're not going to get that full width. And so I put in the width of fabric, and then looking at the sheet, what I did is I put in also what is the piece size. Typically, they're almost always square or they're strips. I do have one rectangle in this quilt pattern. And so, but my idea is if I put in the size of the piece, like for example, a 3 1/4 inch block, then I can calculate in the formula how many of those will fit in my 42 inches of usable fabric. And that way I know how many would I get out of a single strip if I cut it 3 1/4 inches wide. And then I know for, let's say, a given piece of fabric, how many of those pieces I need. Let's say I need 32. Well, then I can determine how many strips do I need to cut. Because I feel like you get bogged down a little bit in that thought process when you're starting to do your cutting. Okay, I know I need 32 of these 3 1/4 inch squares, but how many strips do I need to get that? So I thought if I put that in, a table like this in Excel, I'd already have thought through that and validated it with some formulas. And once I checked when the formula was working, I knew I could use it for all of them. The oddball in that is there's 2 oddballs. Strips are a little bit of an oddball, right? Because it's not like you're trying to calculate how many will fit in a strip. When you're cutting strips with the fabric, you kind of already know. So in those cases, I just put 1. I overrode the formula for how many will fit in 42 inches and just put 1. And that way the formula worked for all the entries. The other oddball is a rectangle because, in the squares, it's easy. You put down here, I'm cutting, for example, 3 1/4 inch squares. And it's the same for the strip width. Plus, when you turn those strips the other direction and start cutting all the pieces, But in the case of a rectangle, you've got two dimensions, which here's the one example. I have a rectangle that is 2.5 by 4.5. So what I did in my list where I was trying to calculate the number of strips to calculate, I just used the 2.5-inch dimension to how many 2.5 inches would fit in 42 inches. And then I put a note to myself, I need 64 of those in total, those rectangles, and I can only get 16 out of a strip, a single strip, if there's 2.5 inches in that strip. What I did is I put a note to myself, cut that strip 4.5 inches wide, because I divided the 2.5 inches into the 42 to find out how many I could cut across. So I'm going to cut the strip the other dimension, 4.5 inches of the rectangle, to get, my total number of pieces, in which I'll need 4 strips. I thought that doing this way, with predefining how many strips you need to cut, would make this easier for me. It may not work for anyone else. Instead of cutting all the pieces, like let's say I start with piece A and it says I need 32, I thought the first thing I would do is I would just cut all the strips that I need in those dimensions, and then I could come back and take the strips and go through and cut all of the individual pieces out of those strips. So one other thing that will influence the cutting instructions and the quilt pattern overall is the method used to cut the pieces for the HSTs and the flying geese. You might decide that you want to adapt this to the technique you're going to use, and you might have to adjust like the cutting instructions accordingly. Because in my case, what I did is I added to this quilt pattern. At the end of the quilt pattern, I have 2 appendix pages, and one is about making the HST squares. I know there are a variety of ways that you can cut HST squares and the piecing for them. But in my case, what I'm doing is I am cutting 2 squares of the different colors of fabric, and we're sewing those together down the center on each side of a line down the center, and then cutting those to make 2 HSTs. And then for the flying geese, I also have a page in the appendix for this. And what this actually does, many of you probably already use this technique. There are other ways to do flying geese as well, but the way this works is it ends up creating 4 flying geese from the piecing that you use. So that's the reason I wanted to mention this about the flying geese and HSTs. You may have other techniques you use which would cause your fabric potentially to be slightly different as far as the piecing you cut in preparation to make those. But that's the approach I'm using. If you look at the quilt pattern, and especially when you're looking at these double sawtooth stars with the pinwheel in the middle, because we have these sawtooth stars, we do have a number of flying geese. We're having, for the inner sawtooth star, 4 flying geese, and for the outer sawtooth star as well, 4 flying geese. So throughout these 6 larger stars, we have quite a few of flying geese to include in the pattern. And of course, one of our favorite things to do is ironing. So I'm just going to iron the fabric because, when you fold it back up before you cut it, it'll get a little bit of creasing, right? But it does have some of this fabric, if you look at it, it does have some harder wrinkles in it, which, as we all know, kind of influences your cutting, makes it a little bit more difficult to cut. So I'm going to try to iron some of that out and make it a little easier to cut the fabric. So I'm going to get started doing some cutting here, and I'm going to start with my gray fabric. And looking at the cutting instructions, I need 32 3¼ inch squares. And so for that, I'm going to cut 3 3¼ inch strips. So fabrics B and C and the gray fabric are 3½ inch strips, and I need a total of 8, 4 of each for B and C, so 8 of those strips. So for the gray fabric, I cut my strips, and for fabric piece A, I have 3 of the 3 1/4 strips, and for fabric pieces B and C, I have 8 of the 3 1/2 inch strips. And now I'm going to cut 32 of the 3 1/4 squares for fabric piece A. I know sometimes some people say that they do all their cutting standing up, and then sometimes you just need to sit down for a while, right? The challenge is sitting down, I find. Maybe you can leave some comments of your good suggestions you have. But the challenge is that normally when you're standing up, your arm is like this, right? And you have leverage. But then when you sit down, it's your hands kind of like this. So you either have to decide, am I going to hold the knife differently so I have more leverage on it? Or am I still going to try to raise my shoulder and cut like this? I actually find that this actually is more comfortable when you're seated. But if you have some good suggestions for cutting while seated, post those so other people can, hear what you've learned. And I just find that after a while standing up, you're bent over and you start to get a little bit tired of standing and bent over for quite a while. So that's why I actually sit down. I prefer to sit down some while I'm doing the cutting. And then, of course, the other thing that makes a big difference is you're having a sharp knife because that's something Sherry's always gently reminding me. I don't know if it's gentle or not sometimes, but she's reminding me about is that I need to use sharp tools. Usually it's me with a drill bit or something like that, working on something around the house. And so what am I going to have left here? This folded. Usually that's where the suggestion comes in is I'm trying to drill a hole or something and the drill bit's not that sharp. And so I'm ending up with not as good results. For fabric piece A, I have my 32 3 1/4 inch gray squares cut. And for fabric pieces B and C, those are 3 1/2 inch strips. And I have 8 of those strips cut here. Now moving on to the blue fabric. And here I have the fabric piece E. I need 24 4 7/8 inch squares. And I'm going to get 8 of those out of a strip. So I'm going to cut 3 strips. 3 strips at 4 7/8. So next, moving on to fabric piece F in my blue fabric, it looks like I need 24 2 1/2 inch squares. And looking at my chart here, I can get 16 of those out of a strip. So I'm going to cut 2 strips at 2 1/2 inches. Okay, now moving on to fabric G. With our blue fabric, we need 6 5 1/4 inch squares. So looking at my list of how many strips to cut, and for that fabric, I can get 8 out of a strip. So I only need 1 strip at 5 1/4. Moving on to fabric 8, it looks like I need 12 3 1/4 inch squares. And looking at my how many strips to cut list, it says I can get 12 out of a strip easily. So I'll just cut 1 strip at 3 1/4. Fabric I with the blue fabric is one of the coping strips. And it says that I need this to be 5 1/4 inch, and I need 3 of those. Fabric piece J is also a coping strip going around the panel, and it looks like I only need 2 of these, and these are 3 3/4 by 32 1/2. For fabric piece E, I have my 3 4 7/8 inch strips, and I'm now going to cut 24 squares out of those. So for fabric F, I need 24 2 1/2 inch squares, and I'm going to cut those using my 2 1/2 inch ruler to make it easier. So for fabric piece G, I need 6 5 1/4 inch squares. I have my 1 strip. I'm going to cut those out. For fabric piece H, I need 12 3 1/4 inch squares. I'm going to cut those out of the one strip I cut. Two of the coping strips that go around the panel, the 3 3/4 inch width strips, are to be cut to 32.5. So I'm going to use the ruler on my mat to do that. I've already lined up the other piece right on the edge of the ruler, and I'm going to use this ruler to go right at 32.5. Before I move on to cutting the next fabric, I'm just gonna quickly make sure that I got all my pieces covered. And so I have fabric E, 24 of the 4 7/8 inch squares, fabric F, 24 of the 2 1/2 inch squares, fabric G, 6 of the 5 1/4 squares, and fabric H, 12 of the 3 1/4 squares. Fabric I is 3 of the 5 1/4 inch coping strips, and I did trim the end of the selvage off because we'll have to sew these together later. And then we need fabric J, 2 of the 32.5 by 3 3/4 inch coping strips, and I went ahead and cut these to length since they don't need to be sewed together. Time to move on to cutting the black fabric. And looking at our cutting instructions for fabric L, I need 24 4 1/2 inch squares, and the number of strips I need for that are 3 4 1/2 inch strips. For fabric M, I need 6 9 1/4 inch squares, and looking at how many strips I need for that, it's going to be 2. So I need 2 9 1/4 inch strips. I don't have a long ruler that's also over 9 inches wide, so I'm going to have to use my table to measure this, my mat. Person doesn't want to mess this up, because you mess this up, it's a big mistake, right? Might not have enough fabric to do the whole quilt. You mess this cut up. Okay, there's one 9 1/4 strip. Okay, so fabric N is a little bit of an oddball because it's a rectangle. And so we can see that its size is 2.5 by 4.5. We need 64 of these, so 2.5 by 4.5. And looking at the list I put together for how many strips to cut if using 42 inch fabric, I have that we would need 4 strips, but the strip needs to be cut 4.5 inch wide. So I need 4 4.5 inch wide strips. So next on our list, the black fabric for fabric O, we need 128 3 1/4 inch squares. And looking at my list of how many strips to cut for each fabric piece, it shows that I'm going to get around 12 out of each strip. So I need 10 of these 3 1/4 inch strips. Okay, to the last fabric for black, it's fabric piece P. We need 64 2.5 inch squares, and looking at my list of how many strips to cut, we need 4 strips at 2.5 inches. Now I'm going to cut my pieces out of the strips, and for fabric piece L, I need 24 4.5 inch squares. And of course, the 4.5 inch ruler makes it very nice to cut 4.5 inch squares. For fabric piece M, I have the 2 strips I had cut to 9 1/4 inch strips, and now I need to cut 6 squares of that size. So for fabric piece N in the black fabric, I need 64 2.5 by 4.5 inch rectangles. And I had cut 4 of the 4.5 inch strips. And now I'm going to cut those 2.5 inch to get the rectangle 64 pieces. Continuing on to piece O, I need 128 3.25 inch squares. So for fabric piece P, this is the last one in the black fabric, and I need 64 2.5 inch squares. I had previously cut 4 2.5 inch strips, so now I will cut those 64 squares. Okay, well, I've finished cutting the black fabric, and just to review, for fabric piece L, I have 24 4.5 inch squares. For fabric piece M, I have 6 9.25 inch squares. For fabric piece N, I have 64 2.5 by 4.5 inch rectangles. And for fabric piece O, I have 128 3.25 inch squares. And for fabric piece P, I have 64 2.5 inch squares. So looking at our white fabric, we have fabric piece S. We need 24 2 7/8 inch squares, and in my list of how many strips to cut, I calculated I would need 2 of those, 2 7/8 inch. For fabric piece T from our white fabric, we need 108 3.25 inch squares. And looking at my list of how many strips to cut, it shows that I'm going to get about 12 of those from each strip, so I need 9 strips at 3.25. For fabric piece S, we need 24 2 7/8 inch squares. So we'll cut those out now. For fabric piece T, we need 108 3.25 inch squares, so time to cut those. Okay, so that wraps up cutting of the white fabric, and now I have my 24 2 7/8 inch squares and 108 3.25 inch squares. Moving on to the yellow fabric, we see here in our cutting instructions that we need for fabric piece Y 64 3.25 inch squares. And looking at my list of how many strips to cut, I calculated that I would get around 12 per strip, so I will need 5 strips at 3.25. For fabric piece Z, this is a width of fabric by 2.5 inch strip, and I need 8 of those. Okay, so down to the last squares to cut for fabric piece Y. So I have the fabric strips ready that I had cut previously, and now I'm just going to cut out 64 of the 3.25 inch squares. Okay, so that wraps up the cutting for the yellow fabric. For fabric piece Y, I have 64 of the 3.25 inch squares. And for fabric piece Z, I have 8 of the width of fabric by 2.5 inch strips. Well, I hope you enjoyed accompanying me as I talked about this new quilt pattern, Astro Journey. And in the next video, since this quilt pattern has 3 different types of star blocks, it has the double sawtooth star with the pinwheel in the center. It has the hunter star and the eccentric star. And we see that there's 6 of the larger star blocks. And for each of those smaller type of star blocks, there are 16 each. So in the next video, I plan to go over the instructions for making at least 1 or 2 of those star blocks. works, and we'll move forward on getting this quilt done. So in the meantime, I would like to encourage you to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already done so. Please leave any comments you have about how you feel about the quilt pattern, the fabrics, any suggestions you have for other quilters. Give a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video. And I encourage you too to visit my wife's channel on YouTube, Lessons Learned. She has 3 videos a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and I'm sure you'd enjoy watching her videos. So until the next video, I'm wishing you happy sewing and beautiful finishes.